Alfredo-Angulo, fresh off his big win over Peter Quillin, had this to say. He says, Al Haymon has given me far more than I've given back. Angulo was quoted as saying, for the past 5 or 6 years prior to 2019, I never felt complete. Angulo told BoxingScene.com, I was training for fights, but I felt like I wasn't getting any better, and it showed in the ring. But I remain grateful to Al Haymon and all that he's done for me and my family. He's like a father figure to me, and I have to be honest, he has given me far more than I've ever given him back in the ring. It meant so much to be able to give a performance like this, to show that I'm still willing to give everything I have to reach my goal of winning a super middleweight title. You know, most of the time we talk about Al Haymon here on the channel, it's in regards to, you know, how they conduct business over there at the PBC, that they do insist on operating as an island, and that results in either fights that take too long to make or fights that don't happen at all. You know, this makes boxing fans unhappy. But one subject in regards to Al Haymon that we haven't covered is his reputation for treating his fighters very well. I mean, here we see Alfredo-Angulo singing Al Haymon's praises. And I don't doubt for a second that Al Haymon does indeed compensate his fighters in all the ways that his reputation suggests, that he's very good to his guys. Oh yeah, I believe it. And there's a reason I believe it. Whether it's Alfredo-Angulo or Leo Santa Cruz, it is not uncommon for a PBC fighter to be seen or heard or quoted singing the praises of Al Haymon. I do believe that Al Haymon compensating and accommodating his fighters in such a fashion is how you can explain the fealty that they exhibit to him and what is his PBC. That even in situations where these fighters are being made big offers to participate in other events on other sides of the street, you know, these guys will choose to stay on the PBC side of things. They'll choose to remain where they are. And I believe that Al Haymon accommodating his boys, well, that's got a lot to do with it, you know?
It's because he treats them good.
But how good is too good? That is the question that I present to you, ladies and gentlemen. How good is too good when it comes to the compensation that Al Haymon's fighters receive?
It's a legitimate question.
You know, I'm of the opinion that these guys definitely are being compensated. I don't doubt it. And it's for this reason that they don't see a need to take any risks. They don't. Why participate in a risky fight when you could make $1 or $2 million or close to it fighting in showcase fights that aren't risky fights? You understand? In a situation like that, taking a risk ain't even gonna feel necessary. Why? Why take a risk? Why cross the street to fight against a risky opponent when you're making good money right there where you are, fighting in showcase fights? Showcase fights against opponents that don't pose much resistance, no hopers, guys that don't stand much of a chance of winning. You know, the kind of guys that Gervonta Davis has been fighting for the last 2 years, those kinds of guys. In a situation like that to where you're getting good money to fight those kinds of guys, well, you're not gonna see the need to take a risk, because you're getting good money as it is. So what that may result in is fighters that perhaps become self-satisfied, complacent, their overall growth plateaus, and suddenly they're just flat. They go out there, they're not as sharp as they would be if they were in there fighting, you know, top-level guys, top-shelf opponents, risky guys, where you gotta fight a tight fight. You gotta be on your P's and Q's. You gotta cross all the T's and dot all the I's. You know, you're fighting guys like that,
You on your game.
you're gonna be sharp. But if you're fighting in showcase fights and you're making good money as a result of fighting in showcase fights, you know, kind of opponents that don't stand much of a chance of beating you, the kind of guys that are actually there to make you look good, when you're making good money fighting those kinds of guys,
Doing that.
you're gonna become complacent.
Fat and happy fighters.
And in the hurt business, well, it doesn't really behoove you to be a fat and happy fighter.
Nope.
It doesn't. Because if you're fat and happy, you're not hungry, right?
Right.
I mean, I see it just as well as you guys see it, that Alfredo-Angulo is sitting here today singing Al Haymon's praises for standing by him, for sticking with him, for supporting him and his family. I see that side of it, and I acknowledge it. But there is another side of it, and I have to acknowledge that as well. And that is the side where Peter Quillin stands here today, on the other side of that. That, you know, Peter Quillin, this is a guy who, ahead of this fight, he had something like, I don't know, 35, 36 pro fights, something like it. 35, 36, something like that. Only one professional loss in all those different contests. Just one. To another good fighter, Daniel Jacobs, a couple of years ago. No shame in that. No shame in losing one fight to a good fighter. No shame. But there is some reconciliation required when a fighter like this, with a pro record like this, goes in there and loses to the likes of an Alfredo-Angulo. I mean, how does it get to the point to where an Alfredo-Angulo wants it more than a Peter Quillin? How does it get to that point? How does it get to the point to where the likes of a Peter Quillin is not on his game enough, is not sharp enough, is not invested enough to work his way past the likes of an Alfredo Angulo? How does it get to the point to where a Marcus Brown, undefeated fighter, former Olympian, how does it get to the point where he can't make it past the likes of a Jean Pascal?
How?
A faded former champion who's retired once, at least once already, and come back. How does it get to the point to where Quillin can't get past Angulo?
Yeah.
Marcus Brown can't get past Jean Pascal.
Yeah.
You got Keith Thurman. We see what happened. It was a great fight. I mean, it really was a great fight, and there was genuine intrigue. But why? Why was there intrigue? Because people weren't sure that Keith Thurman could beat this guy. And we are talking about, or we were talking about an undefeated champion who's supposed to be in his prime, but he goes in there with a legend, but an old legend, an aging fighter, a guy who's been through his share of ring wars, okay? And apparently, the seasoned vet...
With nothing to prove.
Who should be all but retired, by the way. Better still, the seasoned vet wanted it more than the young guy in his prime. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that this is as a result of fat and happy fighter...
Not being hungry.
You take your eyes off the ball for a second, and it cost you. Maybe that particular fight, you thought it was going to be an easy fight, you thought it was going to be a gimme fight, and then it turns out, no, that's not what that was. Or, you've been fighting a bunch of stiffs, bunch of guys that really can't pose much resistance, so you're not accustomed to having to push back and push back hard. You're not accustomed to that. You get flat.
Flat.
Your growth, it stagnates, you plateau. Then somebody with a pulse walks in there, and you don't know what the fuck to do with him, because the guy won't go away. That happens, And that is as a result of fighters who really aren't hungry. I mean, they're still fighters.
That's their job.
By definition, fighters by trade, yes. But are they hungry?
Yeah.
Are they accustomed to dealing with that element of danger that keeps you sharp, that keeps you on your P's and Q's?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that if there is a consequence to how well Al Haymon treats his fighters and how well these fighters are compensated, I think that would be it. I think that is the consequence.
Yeah.
That if you're an Errol Spence, right? You got a Mikey Garcia, he says he wants to fight you,
He's a little guy.
You look at that, what you stand to make from that.
It's a payday.
And you tell yourself, oh, well, I can make good money beating this guy, and he doesn't stand much of a chance of beating me. Everybody knows it.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly, fighting Crawford, it's not that important. Why risk it all with Crawford right now when I can fight this guy and make this kind of money?
For what?
That risk isn't necessarily necessary, You're looking at Danny Garcia. Make good money fighting the likes of an Adrian Granados. Tough kid, nothing against him, But there are bigger challenges in the welterweight division for Danny than Adrian Granados. I mean, it's just the truth. You're not going to be too keen on taking a risk on a Terrence Crawford when you can make good money fighting an Adrian Granados. It just stands to reason, That yes, the fighters are well compensated, but it's not without consequences. It's just a simple case of causality. When you got a lot of guys, and maybe, they don't have to work too hard to make good money. They're not going to be as hungry as a result.
They're not.
But if they're hungry, and they got to take the risks to get the big cash, when they've got to take those chances to get the big fights, get the big money, you end up with fighters that they're sharp, they're on their game, they don't slip, they're not comfortable, they're not fat and happy, they want to get there, they're still trying to get there. So they take on those dangerous opponents, they take on those legacy fights,
They want to.
I mean, it's just a case of causality, that if there is a consequence of the cushy treatment that Al Haymon gives his guys, well, that would be it. That yes, you got the Angulo side of it, but there's also the Marcus Brown, Peter Quillin, Keith Thurman side of things. There's also that. I mean, you look at Leo Santa Cruz. This guy doesn't seem keen on taking any kind of risks with Gary Russell, and Leo Santa Cruz is yet another guy who sings Al Haymon's praises. Yet for all this time he's been a champion. He's been a champion since he beat Carl Frampton in the rematch. I think that was in 2017.
Yeah.
He got the WBA title back. He gets the title back. And from then till now, we don't see any wheels in motion for that Gary Russell fight, and it's likely because, well, from where Leo is sitting, why the hell would I take a risk on Gary when I can make good money fighting these fucking guys,
These guys?
Why do it?
For what?
That's what I think's going on. That's how I reconcile
The upset.
Peter Quillin losing that fight to Alfredo Angulo. That should have been a gimme fight for Peter, man. Should have been an easy fight to win. Just box him, stay on the outside, do what you got to do, you're sharp. You look at his punches, they're kind of flat, there's not that much on him. He certainly couldn't keep Angulo off him.
Nope.
And Peter's not an old guy.
Nope.
He doesn't have a bunch of wars. I mean, he doesn't. He only ever lost one fight, But he couldn't get past this guy, and I think it's because, well, Peter wasn't hungry. Peter wasn't hungry. What was he building towards? So if you want my take on this weekend's fight,
Quillin-Angulo.
if you want my take on Al Haymon having a reputation for treating his fighters very good, if you want my opinion, and you're here, so I'll assume that you do.
Do you?
I mean, you could be somewhere else if you didn't, but you're here. So if you want my opinion, and you're here, so I'll assume that you do. Well, that's what I think. That, maybe he has a reputation for treating his fighters very good. Maybe he actually does treat his fighters very good, but it's not without consequences. And this weekend's fight, I don't think for a second that heralds the return of El Perro Angulo to the elite level upper echelon status. I don't think that's what that heralds, and I think that has more to do with Peter Quillin gradually losing his hunger, having that fire in his belly extinguished and satiated over time because he's a well-compensated fighter. He gets treated good for fighting who he's fighting, and the people who he's been fighting, they aren't exactly the upper echelon, upper crust guys. I mean, when's the last time that Peter Quillin was involved in a risky situation? It's been years since the Daniel Jacobs fight, you understand? It's been years since that fight, and in recent memory, that was the most risky guy that he had ever fought. Up until that point, that was the riskiest guy he fought in recent memory. Since that time, and that was years ago, since that time, what risky opponents, what upper echelon guys has he actually squared off against? So when you're on a schedule like that, fighting those kinds of guys for that amount of time, it's quite possible that because you're well compensated, because you're being treated good by the outfit that you're with, you're not hungry anymore. So that opens the door for a guy like Angulo to actually want it more than you do, even though you're supposed to be the fresher guy. Since losing that Daniel Jacobs fight, Peter Quillin had something like, 3 fights. One fight, comeback fight, tune-up fight, with a guy that had something like 21 pro losses. Obvious shaking off the cobwebs fight. He then fought J. Leon Love, and that's an interesting fight, interesting situation, because while the name of J. Leon Love may be familiar to some people in some circles, is he really one of the best and brightest fighters at the weight?
Is that what he was?
Was he at that time when they fought? I mean, is this really an upper echelon guy?
Is that what he was?
What's the element of danger here for Peter Quillin having fought that guy, And Peter won that fight. That's the most you can ask him to do. He then has a fight with Caleb Truax, what was the former IBF champion. This guy was champion for all of 10 seconds. He fought and beat a very shop-worn James DeGale. He won the first fight, lost the subsequent rematch, though not by much.
Talking about Truax.
And, he has this fight with Peter Quillin. Peter Quillin fights Caleb Truax, whatever. Results in a no decision. You just think about these fights as a whole, as a package, that this is what Peter Quillin has been doing since losing the fight to Daniel Jacobs. And it very much seems like, okay, the riskiest guy that you have fought in recent memory was Daniel Jacobs. That was the riskiest fight. That was the most dangerous opponent you faced in recent memory, except it wasn't recent. That was years ago. And these are the guys you've been fighting. Now, some of these matchups are solid matchups on paper. They are. The J. Leon Love fight, you could call that a solid matchup.
On paper.
You could even call the Caleb Truax fight a solid matchup.
On paper.
But at the end of the day, the question remains, were these really the best and brightest fighters at the weight? I mean, in that span of time, what is it, 2-3 years, something like that? In that duration of time, you haven't built yourself towards a title shot yet. You really haven't.
In 2-3 years.
I mean, you haven't lined yourself up for one that you could have became a mandatory for at least one of these belts, at least by now, but that's not what happened.
And it should have by now.
Should it have even taken this long? And in that kind of an environment, that opens the door for the fighter to become complacent and flat. He's not as hungry. He doesn't want it as bad as maybe some other guy that's still hanging around, some guy like Angulo, It opens the door for the fighter's fire, the fire in his belly, to be extinguished. And now he's just going through the motions. He's just hanging around. But does he really want to be there? There's not a sense of urgency, right? Given today's political environment when it comes to the sport of boxing, how political things have become, there's not a sense of danger, not an element of danger, and not a sense of urgency when you know that most of the best fights at the weight are stifled by the politics of boxing. So you don't look at them as eventualities. You know that, due to political boundary lines, there are quite a few guys that you're probably never going to have to fight.
So you're not worried about them.
So then you get comfortable.
You're not bothered.
You get complacent, at least a bit. I mean, you figure that at some point you might fight for a title, but the element of danger is not an immediate element of danger. There's no sense of urgency. Thus, your sharpness, it wanes. It becomes dull.
Because you ain't worried.
After a while, you're just going through the motions. I mean, I reiterate, if Alfredo Angulo beat Peter Quillin. I think that has more to do with Peter Quillin not being on the level, the elite level, the upper echelon level. I think it has more to do with that, more to do with Peter Quillin over time just becoming flat and complacent than Angulo returning to the upper echelon. You know, I mean, I think it's a nice Cinderella Man story. It's a nice Cinderella Man moment in the sport of boxing. But I'm not a wide-eyed optimist, okay? Angulo beating Peter Quillin is as a result of a mix of things that all converged on the night of the fight. And one of the key elements is that, you know, a guy like Peter Quillin, he really should be sharper than that. He should be a level above, a cut above a guy like Angulo, who's racked up as many professional losses as he has. And yet, for some reason, Angulo just wants it more, you know? So he can press the issue on to Peter Quillin. And Peter Quillin will struggle with this kind of guy even now, because Peter Quillin's not accustomed to being pushed. He's not accustomed to generally facing resistance on a regular basis against guys that got a pulse. So by the time one rolls around, you don't know what the fuck to do with him because he won't go away. That's what I think. That's what I see here, you know? I mean, if you want my thoughts on it, those are my thoughts on it. That if the fight worked out the way that it did, it's because Peter Quillin has just been going through the motions and he's been flat for a while now. He really hasn't made any noise. And in that span of time, from the time he lost to Daniel Jacobs until now, you would have thought that he worked his way up into an interesting situation. But in all honesty, he hasn't. And the most interesting news he's made as of late is being upset by the likes of an Alfredo Angulo. That's the most noise he's made in recent memory. So, you know, I think as far as what happened and why, it's self-explanatory. Peter Quillin wasn't hungry anymore, and it finally caught up to him. It caught up to him when he was confronted with Alfredo Angulo, who, you know what, maybe his best days are behind him. Maybe he is a shop-worn fighter, but at least right now, he wanted it more than Peter.